co-host of the family meeting on WCPT. Thank you all for supporting our station. Thank you all for the hard work that you guys do in helping us stay strong in the progressive movement. So I'll make this really, really brief because I'm going to leave here and head to the show at 4 o'clock today. This is what I think of when I think of Thom Hartmann. He makes my head hurt. Anybody want to gather why? Any show of hands of why? Because he writes stuff like this that makes you have to what? On the way out, I said to my wife Ann, who's back in the back, raise your hands. I said, you know, Thom has all these great books, and he's got this great show, and he's got this great following, and people love him because he makes you think, and not enough of us think. Would that be your first statement?
Oh yeah.
But Thom doesn't let us slide on that, so I'll keep it real simple. Let's all give a great welcome to the great Thom.
Can you hear me back there in the cheap seats? Yeah. Is this better? Yeah. Okay, let's do that. I wanted to just, tell you a little story out of the book. It's just, but it's kind of contemporary history. I have gone through this on the air, but not in one long, complete rant like this, because I keep hitting these commercial breaks every 12 minutes. So, let's step into the Wayback Machine. Back in 1942, it was a Chicago newspaper, the Chicago Star-Tribune, I believe it was, or Tribune Star, whatever it was called back then, that Harry Truman held up with that famous headline that says, "Dewey beats Truman," right? Yeah. No, it was 48, too, the election of 48. And the reason why the pollsters got it wrong was because they were just polling the general population. They weren't standing outside the voting places and asking people how they voted. Exit polls had not really been developed at that point in time. And so what happened as a result of that colossal failure of polling was that it started getting scientific. People who really had a background in polling started getting into it. And so by the mid-1950s, the polls were getting real accurate because they started doing exit polls in the 56 election and then the 1960 election. And by the 1964 election, the exit polls were so good that the new television networks, this was right on the edge of, this was when color TV was just beginning, that the television networks started relying on the exit polls to call elections, because sometimes it would take a day or two for all those paper ballots to be counted, sometimes even 3 days. But they had, the polling was really tight. And so in the election of 72, in the election of 78, in the election of 74, 78, 70, oh, you got it. Let's see.
76.
Yeah, thank you, 76. 72, 76, 80, 84, 88, 92, 96, every one of those elections, the television networks relied on the exit polls, and they accurately called every single presidential election based on the exit polls until 2000. And in 2000, and this had just developed into an elaborate science. This guy Warren Matofsky was the lead guy in the country who had figured out how to do this, and was a company was called Matofsky Edison, and they were the gold standard of polling. And we weren't the only ones using them, by the way. European countries started using them in the 80s as this became real scientific. Canada started using them. They still use them to this day. In the election that they had in the UK a couple of weeks ago when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. It took 4 days for them to count the vote, but we knew the night of the election that he had won because of the exit polls. Exit polls are they're never off by more than a point. I mean, it's just, they've gotten so good at this that they're just never wrong. And then this weird thing happened in 2000. The exit polls in Florida showed that Al Gore won Florida by close to 100,000 votes. And yet, when and you'll recall, some of the networks actually called the election based on that and said Al Gore's our next president. And then George Bush's cousin, who worked at Fox News, went on Fox News and said, no, it's George Bush. And then it all kind of went to hell. But the guys at Matofsky Edison were like, what the hell is going on here? We did this right in Florida. We know that Al Gore won Florida. And you know, what happened? And they had no answer for this. They were just like, ugh. And so George Bush got inaugurated. The exit poll people got humiliated. And then in April, a couple months after the inauguration, while you know George Bush had put the terrorism task force on hold, he gave it to Dick Cheney and said, "You take responsibility for this." They didn't meet until the 1st of August. The terrorism task force that had been set up by Richard Clark and Sandy Berger. No, yeah, Sandy. Was it Sandy Berger? Was the national security advisor for Clinton? Yeah. And Al Gore. You know, they had set up this whole, because they knew. In fact, Al Gore. Well, Sandy Berger on my show said Al Gore told Dick Cheney, and he knew that Clinton had told Bush, bin Laden is coming to get us. This has to be your #1 priority. So Bush put Cheney in charge of that, and like I said, they didn't even meet. Instead, they were meeting in March. They had their energy task force meetings. Cheney was having those where they were carving up Iraq, you know, and who we're going to sell Iraq to. So anyhow, that was going on. But in April, a BBC report broke that had been done by investigative reporter Greg Palast. And what they found was that prior to the election, about 6 months prior to the election, Governor George Bush of Texas had taken the list of all the felons arrested in Texas in the previous 10 years, or convicted in the previous 10 years, which was, you know, I don't know, close to 1 million people, fairly large list, that was overwhelmingly black and Hispanic. And had provided that felon list to his brother Jeb, who was the governor of Florida. And Jeb had, without matching middle names or birthdays, just first and last names, had compared the Texas felon list with the Georgia voter list. And lo and behold, they found a lot of very, very similar names. Now, the similar names seem to be mostly people who were black or Hispanic. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. Hispanic people, all their names are derived from one language, Spanish. And most black people in the United States who are not, you know, recent immigrants from Africa, their names are all derived mostly from English. And in some cases, there's a subpopulation that's substantially named after presidents. Most of the 80% of all the people named Washington in the country, 78% of all the people named Jefferson in the country are African American, named after presidents. But otherwise, they were named after plantation owners who were all, you know, English language, Scotch, Irish, and British. So these are two small name pools, English and Spanish. Whereas if you look at Caucasians across the United States, you've got names that come from all over the place. You've got names that come from Poland, you've got names that come from Russia, you've got names that come from Sweden, you've got names that come from Greece, you've got names that come from Hungary, I mean, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. These are all separate languages and their names are all different. So if you take a list that is really heavily black and Hispanic and you compare it with a whole state's voting list, you know, 20, 30 million people in Florida, who are you going to find the overlap? All the black and Hispanic people. And sure enough, that's what happened. Jeb Bush knocked 90,000 African Americans and I think it was an additional 20 or 30,000 Hispanics off the voting rolls in Florida on the assertion that these were all people who were felons in Texas who moved to Florida and registered to vote, and in Florida you can't vote if you're a felon, so we're going to remove them from the list. And when this was revealed, now this explains why the exit polling was off, first of all, but when this was revealed, all hell broke loose in Florida. I mean, this was in April and May now. We're starting to get into the early summer, and you all remember this in 2000. I mean, just think back to 2000. There was a huge lawsuit. The NAACP was suing both the Bush campaign and Jeb and Katherine Harris personally. The ACLU was suing. There were literally hundreds of thousands of people, mostly African Americans, out in the streets in cities all across Florida. People who figured out that, you know, now I know why when I showed up to vote they told me I couldn't vote and sent me away. And just, you know, and George Bush's popularity was sinking like a stone. There were articles in the paper about, you know, he's an illegitimate president and what do we do in the future? And was this presidency the result of a crime? And all this kind of stuff. I mean, his popularity ratings were around 37%. We had not seen numbers like that since Richard Nixon. He was just going down in flames. And then, of course, you know, a few months later, 9/11 happened. And we all forgot about it. It just kind of went away. It just vanished from the national consciousness. And then he was, you know, cranking up his war in Afghanistan, and then his war in Iraq, and then it was time for re-election, and it just, none of this stuff ever got mentioned. But the Republican Party was looking at this going, wow, this is kind of cool. I mean, you know, this guy would have lost by 90,000 votes in Florida had we not done this. We got to figure out a way to do this again in other states. Only we don't want to get busted, right? We got to do it in a way that doesn't get us in trouble. So, Republican from Ohio, Bob Ney, who's a friend of mine, you've heard him on my show. Back then, Bob's story is fascinating if you haven't heard me tell it on the air. He wrote a book called Sideswiped. I don't know if they have it here in the store. It's out of print now, but you can buy used copies. But he tells his story. Back then, he was very overweight and very alcoholic. I mean, like, you know, 150 pounds overweight and drunk all the time. He'd start drinking in the morning. And he supervised the writing and the passage of this legislation, and he was totally in the bag with the Republicans. Well, Bob also, and this is just kind of anecdotal to this whole story about voting, but I thought you'd like to know, especially for the next time you hear Bob on the show. Bob had been married to a woman from Iran and worked in Iran for 6 years. And he spoke fluent and read fluent Farsi, the Iranian language. And so, I forget what the year was. It was early on in the Bush administration. We did not have relations with Iran. The United States has no official relations with Iran. So the Iranian, the head mullah, Khomeini, wrote a letter to George W. Bush in Farsi and delivered it to the Swiss embassy. The Swiss embassy delivered it to Bob Ney. They had asked that it be delivered to Bob Ney because they knew that he spoke Farsi and that he was kind of a friend of Iran. He had a, you know, he was one of the American legislators who was constantly speaking out about not demonizing Iran and let's try to bring them into the 21st century. So Bob takes this letter to Dick Cheney and says, you know, here's an opening. And the letter said, we will fully recognize Israel. We will stop all funding of Hezbollah. We want to be part of the international community of nations. We're ready to do what it takes. We're ready to work with you. This will be good for us. It'll be good for the United States. And 2 weeks after he delivers that letter to Dick Cheney, Bob gets arrested. Because when Jack Abramoff had taken him to a drinking party and golf trip in Scotland, and he came back, the value of the trip of business class airfare back and forth and a couple of nights in the hotel was a little over $5,000, and Bob had not filed the paperwork with the department in the House where you declare donations in kind. They arrested him, they put him in jail, they put him in solitary confinement, they convicted him, 7 years in prison. The first 2 years he was in solitary confinement, not allowed to speak to the press through the whole rest of that first year of the Bush presidency. And in there, he quit drinking, he lost a whole bunch of weight, and now every year he spends 6 months out of the year with the Dalai Lama in India. And the rest of the time he's back here in the United States and he's on a few radio shows and he's got some gigs here and there. But Bob has turned into a really wonderful guy. He's a genuinely decent human being. It's kind of one of these wonderful redemption stories. So, but anyhow, Bob was the one who told me this story about the Republican Party figured we've got to figure out a way to do this. So what they did was they came up with this new kind of ballot called the provisional ballot. And the idea was, and Bob's quoted in my book on this, the idea was that if somebody goes to the trouble of showing up to vote, even if they're not on the voter lists, they should at least be given a ballot. But what isn't typically told to people who are given provisional ballots is that it's up to the Secretary of State whether they're even opened, much less counted. And so, like in California, provisional ballots not only are opened, but they go to a lot of trouble to find out why this guy got a provisional ballot. And usually it's because, say, somebody's registered to vote in Santa Clara County and their precinct where they're supposed to vote is precinct 11, but they showed up in precinct 12, not realizing because it's just down the street or whatever. And so California counts provisional ballots, as does Illinois. But there's not a single red state in the United States that counts them. They don't even open them unless there's a lawsuit. So they did these provisional ballots, and then preparing for the 2004 election, a couple of states, Ohio was one of them, Ken Blackwell in Ohio, was swapping voter lists with Georgia. Now Georgia it's almost half the state is black. It has a very large black population. So if you take the Georgia voter list, and again, you don't match middle names or birthdays, there's James I. Brown, James L. Brown, James Q. Brown, and then in Ohio it's James P. Brown and James whatever it may be. You're going to get a lot of hits, and sure enough, that's what happened. And so in the 2004 election, and what's his name? John Kerry's running mate.
Oh, John Edwards.
John Edwards, thank you. Came on my show and was like yelling about this. I mean, he was seriously pissed off. He wanted John Kerry to demand an audit because they had officially lost by a little over 150,000 votes, and there were 186,000 provisional ballots that had never been opened. And they were almost all from urban areas, almost all black voters. And he's like, you know, I think we won. And of course, again, the exit polling showed that John Kerry won Ohio. In fact, it showed John Kerry won Ohio by a couple 100,000 votes. But Al Gore didn't want to fight that fight. He was afraid of tearing the nation apart. And so, you know, on we went, right through the fog. And nobody really understood. At that time, nobody knew that Blackwell had been playing with the voter rolls. In fact, the speculation at the time, the thing that I thought was going on, was they were rigging the voting machines. Because they had privatized the vote in 2002 with the Help America Vote Act too. It did two things. It privatized the vote and created these provisional ballots. Well, since then, it's gotten real scientific. Chris Kobach put together this thing called Interstate Crosscheck, which is this giant list where he takes all these states. You take a couple of states that have large black populations and compare them with other states. For example, in the 2016 election, Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State of Georgia, gave the voting list for Georgia to Rick Snyder, the governor of Michigan. And again, large black population in Georgia, not so much generally in Michigan, but in Flint and Detroit, a lot of African Americans. And Rick Snyder knocked over 200,000 people, almost all in Detroit and Flint, off the voting rolls because he said they were also registered to vote in Georgia, and that's against the law to vote in 2 states. And so they're not even doing this felon voter list anymore. That was just too crass. Now they're doing the registered in multiple states thing. And you will recall when Donald Trump introduced Chris Kobach, who was running this whole interstate crosscheck program to get all these Republican secretaries of state all on the same page to throw people off the voting list who were in black neighborhoods, who were in Hispanic, or who had black last names or Hispanic last names. Trump himself said, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of these illegal voters out there, and these Hispanic voters, and and he said, and we found a whole bunch of people who are registered to vote in 4 and 5 states. Yeah. Well, you know, I grew up in Michigan. I was registered to vote in Michigan until I left in 1978. I moved to New Hampshire. I was registered to vote there for the 5 years I lived there. I moved to Georgia for 13 years. I was registered to vote there. I moved back to Vermont. I lived there for 10 years, registered to vote there. Went from Vermont to Oregon. Lived there for 5 years, was registered to vote, moved from Oregon to DC for 7 years, I was registered to vote there, moved back to Oregon 2.5 years ago. I have never called up a Secretary of State's office and said, I'm not voting there anymore, I don't live there anymore.